If you can't hear me in back, raise your hand. If anybody came here with the idea that this was a Frost-Nixon affair, you're in the wrong place.
I'd much rather be David Frost than Richard Nixon, so that's, anyway, this is Zionist Boyhood in 1930s Palestine with Aaron Braveman. I'm Peter Eisenstadt, and I'll be interviewing Aaron. Aaron is a native Rochesterian, born in 1918. He moved to Palestine with his family in 1927 and returned to Rochester in 1935. Other than service in World War II, he had lived in Rochester ever since. And from 1960 to 1983, he was educational director of Temple Brit Kodesh. And most people here, I think, know Aaron. I'm a professional historian, and I met Aaron a little more than a decade ago when I was researching and writing the history of Brit Kodesh, affirming the covenant. We've stayed in touch, and for the last few years we've had lunch frequently on Saturday afternoons. We talk about a lot of things, and one of the things that often comes up is Aaron's years in Palestine. So I asked him, have you ever written about this? Have you ever talked about it? And he really hasn't done that much in a concerted sort of way, so I thought I would interview him. And then I thought it'd be really interesting to have a public interview like this where people could listen to the interview, and I think more people would get access to it that way. So we'll talk, try to keep it under an hour, take a little break, and then answer some questions. Do you want to say a few opening words, Aaron?
About what? You know, Peter, if you get me started, opening words will become a half-hour talk.
Okay. I was thinking more in terms of like introductory thank yous, but we'll wait for those to the end.
As a matter of fact, I do want to say something. I don't know if you could hear the music that was playing as you came in, but that was music of my days. It was done 40 years after that, and therefore it was jazzed up a lot. In my day, the Hebrew songs were not jazzed up. All right, go ahead.
Let me just give a very, very brief historical background to what we'll be talking about. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration that stated they viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, with recognition that Palestine would be shared by Jews and non-Jews. After the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, Britain was awarded a mandate to govern Palestine after World War I. In the census, Palestinian census of 1931, Palestine had approximately 1 million residents, including Aaron and his family. There were approximately 175,000 Jews and 860,000 Arabs. Jews comprised about 17% of the population. The 1930s was a very rapid period of growth for the Jewish population. By the time of the next Palestinian census in 1941, there were approximately 475,000 Jews in Palestine. Jews were about 30% of the population of Palestine. We will be talking primarily about Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Jerusalem, the largest city in Palestine, had a population of about 90,000, about 50,000 Jews, and 40,000 Arabs. Tel Aviv was the fourth largest city in Palestine after Jaffa and Haifa. It had a population of 46,000 with only a negligible population of non-Jews. The rest was Jewish. By means of contrast, Rochester in 1930 had a population of 330,000, which is about 130,000 more than they have now, but that's another story. So, Aaron, why don't we start by talking about your background in Rochester and the decision of your mother to move you and your brothers to Palestine?
That covers a lot of territory, because I have to tell you a little bit about my family, about my parents. My father came from White Russia, from a little shtetl called Dokshitsi, and there are different ways of pronouncing that name. What made it famous is that our own Nettie Scheinman's family came from the same town. He came to the States in 1899, and if any of you are people who know how to work the internet to find out what ship somebody came on, he arrived sometime in December. His parents' name were Mary Braveman and Harry Braveman. So if you look it up and let me know what you find. Now, originally the family settled in Watertown because they had a relative there. And most of the family came to Rochester in 1905. My father stayed behind in Watertown, where he opened a butcher shop. We won't go into that right now. And then he came to Rochester, and he went to work for a junkyard. And after a couple of years, he figured he knew the business well enough, so he opened his own yard, like every other Jew did at the time. And he specialized in rags and papers, and did, there's room down in front. That's a penalty when you come late. In any event, he was well-to-do. He was on the board of every Jewish organization in town, had very many friends, and he was among the first board of trustees of the Rochester Jewish Home. Now, how he met my mother, I have no idea, because she came from a little shtetl in Pennsylvania called Oil City. And how a man of my father's stature would find a beautiful woman, young woman, she was 19 at the time of their marriage, in Oil City. There's only one answer, and that is it must have been an arranged marriage, what we call a shidduch. I'm not sure whether my mother actually finished high school, but she was a very bright woman. At age 6, she used to help her parents who had a dry goods store by standing on a chair and taking the money, ringing up in the cash register. And when she moved to Rochester in 1916, in a short time she made many friends, and among them, I don't know if there's anybody here from the Coco family, but she was a very good friend of Ida Coco, and that played a very important role in our going to Palestine, as you'll hear later. Both my parents were Zionists. My mother founded a new chapter of Hadassah, and Henrietta Zold was in our home. That was before I was born.
Henrietta Zold was the founder of Hadassah.
Thank you.
Well, there might be, anyway, go on.
Well, we have to help each other, Peter.
So anyway, so how did you decide get to Palestine?
And my mother is actually the hero of this saga, because in 1921, on a Friday, May the 13th, my father died in a industrial accident. And if anybody cares for the details about his death and his funeral, is welcome to look up the archives of the Times Union and the DNC, which you can find in the library. Just look up May 14th, 1921, and May 15th and 16th. In any event, so he was gone in 1921. My mother was left with two sons, one age 4 and one 2.5. Pregnant for 5 months with the third son. Obviously, after this accident and tragic death, she went into a deep depression. She came out of it. I don't know. I assume that she was never. Nobody's ever cured, I guess, from this, but she was. And the person who cured her was a rabbi in Chicago who was a healer. And she snapped out of that. And 6 years later, in 1927, she says, boys, we're going to Palestine. Now, why we're going to Palestine, we have all kinds of theories. But I think the most prominent theory, the one that made the most sense, was that my grandmother was very concerned about her being left with three boys who were real devils, and wanted to find a husband for her, but was afraid that no American Jew in his right mind would marry a widow with 3 sons like that. So she said, where do you find a shidduch? In Palestine, we'll find somebody and make another shidduch.
So on May 18th, 1927, you boarded the SS Providence in New York City, and you left for Palestine, right?
We were on our way, and those of you who are aviator buffs must know that something exciting happened on May
20th.
20th. May 20th?
May 20th.
This is not a quiz.
Yes, Charles Lindbergh, right? Charles left from Roosevelt Field, Long Island.
It was on his way to Paris, and he was smart. He flew over the ship routes in case an accident, he would be rescued. And we all gathered on the deck, and there he was up in the sky.
And that's as close as Charles Lindbergh ever got to Palestine, I guess, probably.
Thank God for that. Anyway, that night there was a big celebration on board the ship. We were kids. What do we know about celebrations? Everybody was drinking like that. Must have been liquor.
So eventually the Providence took you to Alexandria.
That was a destination, Alexandria. Why Alexandria? Because the Providence was a large ship. And at that time, there was no place in Palestine for it to dock. So
what are your memories of Alexandria?
Well, Alexandria, we docked the day before Shavuot in 1927. And of course, the next day we went to a synagogue. And the synagogue was not far from the hotel. And We went in there. Now, to a child of 8, the synagogue looked like a football field. You couldn't see from one end to the other. And the question is, well, how do people know what's going on the bimah? There was somebody on the bimah with a flag, or flags of different color. And as he changed the flags, people who came there to pray all the time, they knew what it meant. But it was very, very impressive. Just as an aside, my mother met an Egyptian man who wanted to marry her. He offered 2 camels, or he wasn't Jewish, so it didn't work.
So then you got back on a boat, and
Then we got on a small boat.
And what were your first impressions of Palestine and Jaffa?
Well, I was a little bit shook up. Those were my first impressions. I mean, I didn't have a feeling I was coming home or anything like that. It was, we're just traveling. What was I shook up about is that the boat actually didn't dock, but it dropped anchor offshore. Now the adults left the boat by a gangplank and went into a little ship that took them to Jaffa. But the kids, they held over the boat and dropped into somebody's arms. And this is without practice. So I, as a kid, was a little bit shook up. Of course, Jaffa looked different from any other place we saw, and we spent a couple of days in Tel Aviv, which in 1927 wasn't even 20 years old.
And then you got on a bus, right? You want to describe the bus to Jerusalem?
We got a bus to Jerusalem. And the bus, I guess you've all seen Wild West stories with the buses in the West in the 1800s. It was a bus with benches on the side, and we sat that way, and then the bus driver would pick people up along the way. Sometimes he would pick up people who would have chickens or a goat or whatever it was. If he got on the bus, he took them. Now, Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is about 20 miles, and I can't remember how long it took us to get there, because from Tel Aviv, going to Jerusalem was all uphill.
So then you got to Jerusalem, and we have a few pictures of Jerusalem from the way.
Well, not yet. We reversed this.
Well, we're in Jerusalem. Maybe it's a good, don't you think? Anyway, it's a good time to show the picture.
We take, now, the reason I said my mother was the hero of this whole thing is because in Rochester we lived on Harris Street, and Harris Street was at that time a very nice street. We lived in a 4-bedroom home. My mother had a maid. It was nice, middle class living, or upper middle class. And when we moved to our first apartment, or the only apartment we lived in Jerusalem, I think it had 3 rooms. It did not have it had running water, but it had no electricity. My mother had to learn how to use kerosene lamps, how to clean them, and so on. And if you wanted hot water, we had to build a fire outside where there was a heater. Build a wood fire in order to get hot water. There was no stove in the sense that we ever knew of a stove. It was these burners tabletop burners. And then they had a very clever thing for Shabbat in order to keep food warm. I don't know if you've ever seen a 5-gallon tin can, but they used to take these tin cans and make all kinds of things out of it. And one of the things they would make like a little heating oven, and by putting a kerosene lamp in, used to keep it hot, warm. Anyway.
So before we get more into Jerusalem, do you remember what happened on the afternoon of July 11th, 1927?
Do I remember? I'm glad you mentioned the date. That part of the world is known to have earthquakes every 80 years.
And this was the worst, most serious earthquake that Palestine and Israel would have in the 20th century, correct?
That was. We went out on we had something like a patio out of the apartment, and the atmosphere was, it turned color. It was a tan. But came from the earth, and the whole sky was just covered with that.
Now, do you remember the ground shaking and?
Oh yeah, but you know the shaking part, it was something like a 6.4.
About 6.3. The epicenter was in Jericho, about 10, 20 miles from Jerusalem, and about 300 to 500 people were killed in the earthquake. So this was a very serious earthquake.
That's right. Just as an aside, I don't want to scare anybody here, but Israel is ready to have another bang because 80 years have passed already. And they're not prepared for it. 20% of the homes in Israel today were built before they had codes. Okay, so they're.
But we can leave that to the.
We'll leave that
to the public engineers in Israel. Right. But maybe now it's time for pictures, because the next question is, what were basically your memories of Jerusalem in the late 20s? What did it look like, the old city? And
we were very fortunate living in this building that was made into apartments, because there was a young man there who was a barber who took a liking to us kids, and every Shabbat, every Saturday, he would take us for a walk through the old city. And of course, one of the places we visited was what's known as, at that time, was still called the Wailing Wall. Okay, so this is a good picture. Stop right there. No, I really want you to see this for a number of reasons. Number one, there are very few people praying at the wall. It's not like today. Very few. And it actually was an alleyway. It wasn't there was no plaza there or anything like that. So just imagine that versus what you see today in Jerusalem, whatever you call it. So big difference. Now, when we arrived in Jerusalem, actually, we met a couple people from Rochester. Well, one of them was a man known as Chaim Yehuda Goldman, who was the patriarch of the Goldman family. And the other one was a young man by the name of Zussman, who was related to to the Simon family here. And he took us to the third graduation of the Hebrew University in 1927. The first was, of course, 1924. It was one of the most memorable events in my whole Israel experience, because we were sitting in what was a natural amphitheater. From where we were sitting, we could see the Dead Sea. It was a beautiful day. There were pine trees all over the place. And that sight is stuck with me forever. A few years later, I was there, and they modernized it. They cut down all the trees, they took Jerusalem stone, and they built a real amphitheater. But that beauty of what it was like in 1927.
Well, anyway, when you were in Jerusalem, you weren't quite ready for the Hebrew University yet. You had more basic education to go through. So maybe you can talk a little about
My education.
your education in Jerusalem.
You know, there's a part of your brain that's good for music and for language. And I think that part of my brain never developed. Because the first school they sent me was to an old-fashioned cheder. A cheder is a one-room schoolhouse where the teacher sits at the head of a table with a switch in his hand. And he talks, he reads the first book of the Torah with the Ashkenazi pronunciation, and he translates it into Yiddish. I don't know Hebrew, I don't know Yiddish, I don't know what the heck is going on. Well, I didn't last long. One day on the way to school, I saw a little kitten. So I picked the kitten up and I carry it to the door. And the teacher comes to the door, sees me with the kitten. He grabs the kitten, tosses it out the door. I don't know what he said, but I never went back there again. So then they tried another school. I didn't work out in that.
They had a tutor, though. You had a tutor first?
Then I had a tutor who lived within walking distance. And on Saturday, I used to go to be tutored. So at every lesson, he used to complain about a toothache. So he used to go to the cabinet and take out a bottle that looked like water. He used to pour in a little cup, a little glass, and go, I said that he would smile and say, that feels much better. But finally, they found a school that at the time it was wonderful, but later in life, I reflected on it, and I couldn't believe that such a school existed in primitive Palestine, 1927. A woman, her first name was Helen?
I think Miriam.
Miriam Collin. Her brother was the founder, Horace Collin was a professor, was a philosopher, and the founder of the New School for Social Research. She came there in 1925, and she opened a progressive education school. It wasn't exactly like my Aunt Auntie May. We all remember that. But it was a school that was somewhat child-centered, and it was based on different activities. For example, we used to prepare lunch. It was my job to take the rice that was being made for the day and to take out the little stones that we found in it. We also had vegetable gardens. The nicest part of all was there was our teacher, and by the way, the teachers we called by their first name. And this, by the way, is very different in Israel education. You always address the teacher in the third person, like in Germany, I guess. I haven't addressed him in the second person. But anyway, here we call the teacher in the first name, and he lived outside of Jerusalem, and he would take us on hikes through the woods, and I can still smell the pine trees. It's remarkable. I think it's from little things like this that one gains a sense of identity. And eventually I learned Hebrew.
And then around 1930, your family moved to Tel Aviv, correct?
Well, around. It was 1929.
Okay.
By that time, my grandmother found a shidduch for my mother. My mother was married by the great Rabbi Abraham Cook, who was the chief rabbi of Palestine at that time. Evidently, he didn't do such a good job with it, because the marriage only lasted 5 years. However, from it, we have a fourth brother, who's the only brother still living today.
I think you're still alive, though, right? You're still alive, too, though, but...
But I'm not my brother.
Well, I mean, Tel Aviv in 1929, 1930 must have been a remarkable place where all sorts of new buildings were coming up. And maybe we have some pictures of...
Yeah, that last picture of buildings that you showed was one building, and that was the old, what was known as Gymnasia Herzliya in Tel Aviv. Was a high school, very modern high school. Had some remarkable teachers in it.
So with the street, so what did it feel like? Did it feel like a new city? Were the streets laid out and paved? Or?
Well, it was a new city, and after a few years, number of short years, I learned that Tel Aviv wasn't always like that, or entirely like that. Because already in 20 years, they already had shack towns as a neighborhood. It's unbelievable, but people actually lived in shacks that were made, I don't know, they were put up by the people who lived in there. And in order to protect themselves from the rain, they would take these same 5-gallon tins and sort of open them up and then nail them to the wall to keep the rain out.
So what sort of people, what was the background of people who lived in these shanty towns?
Most of them came from Eastern Europe. Many of them were my friends. When I went to school, the school that I went to, was a school that, education at that time in Palestine was done by different political parties. So there was a political party called the Mizrahi. It's an Orthodox group. And they had a school system. And it turned out, I didn't know about this until 1960. When did you come to Rochester? Yeah.
We came to Detroit.
When did you come to Rochester?
Oh, that was after I got married.
What year?
Well, actually,
1960.
in Florida, then in
1960, I think. In 1960, I learned that half a block away from me, Florence Gordon lived. But of course, she's a lot younger than I am. So I wasn't interested in girls that age. And we went to two different school buildings because boys and girls were separated.
So one of your, go on, I mean, I was going to ask you about the library that you went to, which was one of the
library. In Tel Aviv at that time, there was no public library. And I was trying to figure out, at the time, I didn't know why I had to be told, but you couldn't pick your own books. Because he had a limited number of books. And he wanted to educate kids. So you had to read all of Jules Verne. You had to read all of Victor Hugo. And you had to read all of
James Fenimore Cooper, I think.
Yeah, right.
And
The Last of
this
the
is
Weekends.
This is all in Hebrew, right?
Oh yeah, this was all in Hebrew. By that time I was proficient already. But the point is, one book I read 3 times, one after the other. That was Les Miserables. And that really impressed me in terms of the injustice that occurs. And that, of course, also made me conscious of the fact that in Tel Aviv, you know, the people, the Yemenites, they lived in separate neighborhoods that were not as nice as the other neighborhoods and so on. Yeah.
And you also for your entertainment, you went to the movies.
The movies. That was about the only real entertainment we had. We didn't have laptops or Blackberries or any of that stuff. So the only thing we had is the movies. And I think it was 1929 when we finally saw the first talkie. And the movie houses
That was a jazz singer, right?
That was what?
The jazz singer?
I guess everybody knows that. Or are some people too young here to know when talkies first started? But anyway.
It was 2 years after it was first released in the United States.
The what?
It was 27, it was released in the United States.
Was that right? Well, that sounds so bad. 3 years later we got it. But there are a couple of interesting things about the movies. One is Tel Aviv has a very warm climate. It's like Los Angeles. So some movies were just open air movies. And then in the winter they didn't use them when it rained. But other movie houses had one building that was closed, and then adjacent to it that had an open building. The other thing that was interesting is to watch. Sometimes Arabs used to be within in the movie, and they always had a habit of believing that what they were seeing was real and not just a picture. And they used to urge the hero on and tell them to look out and talk to the movie. But plenty of Jewish kids too would do that. Was something. Hey, they never saw it before, and especially when the talkies came in. Wow! And we used to get movies from all over the world, not only American ones. And then they had subtitles in Hebrew that were actually written out in script.
So were you active in the Zionist youth movements while you were in?
Well, every political party had a youth movement. In my case, at that time, I was a member of originally the same group was a youth group of the school. And then one day we invited somebody invited a woman to teach us first aid. And this woman was a member of a general Zionist group. And the next thing I know, our group from the school became a group of this general Zionist group. And practically every kid was part of some youth movement.
And you lived pretty close to the headquarters of a couple of the movements?
Well, I lived not too far away from Beitar. Beitar was the Brit Trumpeldor, which was a part of the revisionist. Zev Jabotinsky was the leader of this group.
And it's a party later of Menachem Begin and Netanyahu today.
That's right. They follow that. Now this group used to dress like the brown shirts of Germany. In brown shirts with whatever that with that belt across their chest. And they used to march up and down the street singing, "The Jordan has two rivers."
Two banks.
Or two banks. That's right. Thank you. Has two banks. That one is ours, and this one is ours too. That was their theme song. The other thing they used to sing is that Judea fell in blood and sword, by blood and sword, and it'll return with sword and blood.
Well, speaking of the military, while you were a teenager in high school, you joined the Haganah, the semi-secret Jewish military organization.
I'm glad you said semi-secret. We always thought it was secret, but I'm certain that the British knew all about it. And that building that you saw that I mentioned as the Gymnasium Herzliya is one of the places where we used to train. We used to go in the building, and there was a special storage area where our stuff was kept, and would cover up the windows so the British shouldn't see that we're in there or whatever. And then we would be trained. Now, in my year that I was a member of the Haganah, I never fired a shot. The only thing we did is we learned how to take apart pistols. And no two pistols were the same, because they used to get it from wherever they could. But it was a well-organized group.
And what was your job?
Yeah, I belonged to a company that was called the Well, I've got to think about what the translation is. It was a communication company. Now, when we think about communication, we think about, you know, shortwave radios and all that stuff. No, in Israel, in Tel Aviv at that time, very few people had telephones. I think telephones were not in private homes, they were mostly for business. And I was assigned to a company of 30 men. I had to know where they lived, where they worked, where they hung out, because we used to have a password in order to go to get into meetings. And the password would be changed every month. And every month we had to communicate with the members of your company and let them know what the new password was. You couldn't do that by paper or by phone or anything. That would be from one person to another. The way we got around was on bicycles. We used to know the city backwards and forwards. It was relatively small. You could get wherever you wanted to go by bike. You should also know that at that time, not all the streets of Tel Aviv were paved. Many of them still had sand. Where Florence lived, the street where I lived was sand. A street nearby, which today is the boutique center of Tel Aviv called Schenken Street, that was paved. So they used to have wooden sidewalks, you know, made up of boards that came in very handy at Lag BaOmer time when we had to build the bonfire. Sometimes if we were lucky, they were paving Schenken Street and it had a barrel of tar there. And so we borrowed the tar and put it in the center of the fire. And I guess we got the prize that year for the largest bonfire in Tel Aviv.
So as you said, Tel Aviv was a small place. And in addition to Florence Gordon, there was other people. You told me you were very close to the famous Hebrew poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik.
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, we lived in Tel Aviv 7 years. We moved 6 times. That's not too bad. That's not even once a year. But one of our homes or apartments was on the street a block away from where Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was the #1 poet of Israel at the time, or of Palestine. They didn't know about Israel. And the name of the street he lived on was Bialik Street, was named after him. And at the end of the street, it was a dead end, well, it wasn't a dead end, but at the end of the street was a city hall. And the mayor of Tel Aviv at the time was a man whose name was Mayor Dizengoff. He lived on Rothschild Boulevard. I think you saw a picture of it. And he used to ride his horse to work every day. And Bialik used to come out, and he had an aide. I think it was his bodyguard. But anyway, he used to hoist him up on the horse. And the kids used to run after him because he looked like Humpty Dumpty sitting on a horse. He was roly-poly. But he was a real nice guy. He would stop kids in the street and ask them, you know, what they're learning at the time and so on. But his wife was, he never had children, by the way. I wonder if it had anything to do with his wife, because his wife didn't like kids. In his yard, he had a grape arbor, and kids used to go into the yard and help themselves to grapes. And according to the law of the Torah, you're allowed to do that, as long as you don't put the grapes in your pocket, take them out. It's okay. She used to come out on the porch on the second floor and pour cold water on it, on us, and it was a relief because it usually was pretty warm at the time.
Well, I mean, Palestine in the early 30s sounds like a fascinating place, but one of the clouds on the horizon, and it's problem that we're still dealing with today, is the relation between the Jews in Palestine and the Arabs. And what are your memories of the Arabs, and what sort of interaction did you have?
Well, we were in Tel Aviv during the riots of 1929, and the people from the Haganah used to come around to give us something to protect ourselves with. What it was were table legs that had hot nails put at one end, and that we were supposed to have these in our house in case we're attacked. We could protect ourselves. But anyway, we weren't too far from the Arab market of the Carmel market, and I remember seeing a cloud of smoke. But actually, within the area where we lived,
the cloud of smoke was
pardon?
The cloud of smoke with the Yafa riots, or
Yeah.
so what do you remember?
But the associations that I had with the Arabs was only in terms of Arabs used to come to sell fruit and vegetable, and I, as a kid, we saw Arabs. We really weren't concerned. Maybe it was just innocence of youth or whatever, but
you weren't concerned in terms
of safety. I mean, I don't know if we had curfews or not from the family, but we used to be out at night, and we never worried about that.
But you mentioned earlier things like movie theaters would be open for both Jews and Arabs,
Yeah.
and they would just go in the street.
Yeah, that was fine.
Okay. Well, why don't we sort of wind things up? How do you think your years in Palestine changed you? What did it mean to you? And
Well, I said I wasn't impressed when I first got there. But I can tell you this, when we did leave, and we were on a boat that left from Haifa, a real dock and so on. And as we were pulling away from the coast, I cried. I really didn't want to leave. I had many friends left behind. As a matter of fact, I had a girlfriend. One friend is a man with whom I still have contact. As a matter of fact, I just talked to him this past week. He called to tell me that he has another great-grandson, which makes him number 12. And this man only had 2 daughters. One daughter had 2 children, and his other daughter married an Orthodox man, and she had 8 children to start with. So he's got a big family coming.
How do you look back on this? I mean, it's a long time anyway, but I can't imagine any part of the world has changed more than Palestine and Israel have. And
Oh, it's changed a lot. Well, one thing hasn't changed, by the way. The percentage of people in Israel who are secular. Well, when we returned to Rochester at the end of 1935, my mother took us to some of her friends. One of them was the grandfather of Isabel Goldman, who had a mattress factory on Hanover Street. And they were a very traditional family. So Mr. Goldberg pulled me aside and says to me, well, when you were in Palestine, did you go to shul all the time? I said, Mr. Goldberg, 70% or more of the people who live in Palestine never go to shul. He looked at me in amazement and he said, so why are they there? But I don't think there's a country in the world that's changed as much as Israel has. One of the reasons I think for that is that when the state was established, there already was a state within the state. In other words, practically everybody except those who weren't was a member of the Histadrut. The Histadrut was run primarily by the Mapai party, and Ben-Gurion was the leader. I mean, the Haganah was under the auspices of the Histadrut.
so did you feel like you were living under the British or living under the...
Well, it's interesting. We were living, the British were always the enemy. And when we were kids and we were riding a bike, we had to have a license. And if they caught you without a license, British police used to stop you and they'd ask you, well, what's your name? And we all had the same name, Mesha Zichmer. That means, Moshe, you find me. But what was it you asked me about that?
Well, I mean, did it feel like it was British, you were under the British were governing Palestine?
Well, the British set a lot of standards, but actually, the Jewish, I don't know, we were called the Yishuv, the people, the Jews who lived in Palestine, were under control in a way of Jewish institutions. I mean, the Histadrut had health care.
The Histadrut is the big labor...
It's a big labor organization. But of course, there also had to be something on the other side, because the people from the right wing had to have their organization. And they were, by the way, and their organization were known as the strike breakers. Every professional person belonged to the Histadrut because they had special groups for doctors, nurses, teachers, any profession. They were all part of the Histadrut. And quite often they would have strikes. So the owners used to get people from the right-wing organization who also claimed to be an organization of workers, and they were active strike breakers.
Well, I think we probably should. Do you have any closing comments, or to end the formal interview and maybe break for a minute and then have some questions?
Well, if you really want to have children with the real Jewish identity, send them to Palestine for 6 years. Except it's not. By the way, that was a Freudian slip. Supposed to be send them to Israel.
Well, who knows?
I'll take a break.
Names do change. Okay. So thank everybody for coming. Thank Joel Elliott so much for helping set this up.
I have something to say.
Did you say in the microphone?
Stand up.
And one day, my sister and I were deep into Yaffo. I lived a block away, probably from the Shuk, which was right where all the Arabs were. And on that day, I'm trying to tell about this thing. I went out, and people were running all around, and my sister and I were deep into the effort. We came back. I came back to our house. It was 1929. It was a Friday, and I saw the porch that we had. Usually my sister Friday, she always washed the floor on the porch. Everything was locked up, and my sister and I didn't know where everything, nothing, there was nothing around there. And I saw an Arab coming towards us. And there was a woman there. She grabbed a hold of us, the two of us, and we ran across the Shuk, which was probably one of the first buildings in Tel Aviv. And she grabbed us, and you can imagine my mother. My father was running this country. And you could imagine my mother with all this going on with the riots. It was started by the Mufti in Jerusalem saying something, that a Jew killed somebody, and they went into Hebron and they slaughtered the yeshiva boys there. And there was I, and we didn't know where to go, and with all this. So finally we went to this building, and we slept on the floor. The next day we looked down, and we saw there was only one Arab in the Shuk, and I remember that he was trying to sell the grapes or whatever he was selling. And this woman, she said, he says, we are cousins, we are cousins. Well, my uncle came to get us, the whole family. We went deep into Tel Aviv. And for 1 month, we slept on the floors. Could not go back to our home. And then one day, they had a curfew. In other words, they lifted the curfew, and we could go out to the park. We had a Yemenite spy. And we found out that the day that they were letting us go out, break the curfew and go to the park, that the Arabs were going to come, pretend they have a funeral, and in there would be guns. So of course when they came, we were able to be safe. So that was another time that we were safe. So this is the story of the beginning of Palestine, and please God, someday I hope and pray that there will be peace between the Arabs and the Jews. We have tried so hard.
have principal for all those years.
You know, they say that that coincidences really don't happen. That whatever happens is supposed to have happened, but it's up to you to find a reason why they happen. So when you figure that one out, you can tell me about it.
You could do it better than I can, Ed. You could do it better. You could figure it out better.
Any other questions?
Oh, why did you leave? Why did you leave Palestine?
Who asked that question?
Why did you leave Palestine?
For one reason, we were all on one passport. And my mother wanted to come back to the States to settle some business. She had a mortgage on some property that my father owned. And the people never paid it. So she wanted to come back, take care of it. In the meantime, she also wanted to divorce her second husband. That's two reasons. The other reason is that she just said, we're going back. Of course, we were a little older then. But my older brother looked at that as an opportunity. He was an organizer for another youth group, and he came to the States and he functioned as this organizer. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Aaron, by the time you left, Hitler was on the rise in Germany.
There was what?
Hitler was on the rise in Germany. And were the German Jews coming to Palestine if they could at that time?
Good question. Good question. As a matter of fact, as Peter mentioned at the beginning, that period was the largest growth of Jewish immigration, right? Many Germans came to Palestine at the time. Most of them were professionals. They had no work for them at that time in Palestine. So what they did is they became porters. Now, a porter in Tel Aviv meant this. He had a flatbed wagon which carried an awful lot of stuff, and it was pushed by humans, okay? And that's what many of them did in Tel Aviv. Others moved into villages where they raised chickens. But what was interesting about the Germans, you ever hear the term Yeke? You know what a Yeke is? A Yeke is a German who came to Palestine, where the climate was quite warm, and it didn't matter what the temperature was. They always wore a jacket. Now you can't say jacket in German because they have no J. They say yeah. So they were called yakets. And from yakets came yakis. And a yaki is a person who, this is the way it has to be done. There are a few yakis here.
Can you tell us about what your thoughts are today on the relations between Israelis and Palestinians?
Today?
Yeah, I mean, in general, what you view as the current.
Well, that's an interesting question. It's really has nothing to do with my life in Palestine at the time, but since he asked me, I'll comment. You know, I'm a great believer in the two-state solution, on the one hand. On the other hand, every person has a right to say what they think should be done in Israel today. But the question is, though, whether we sitting in the United States can tell them what to do. That's a big problem. But we have other means in the United States. I don't think Israel is influenced by anything that what anybody says. But there are, you know, they used to say there's powers greater than Israel, and that's the United States. And as citizens of the United States, we have the right to try to influence our government and our representatives to voice another point of view, and that is to have a two-state solution. Right now, it looks like this thing is dying out, the whole thing, and we're going to miss an opportunity. But that's my take on that now.
Any other questions?
Yes. I just wondered if you could put this in a book. You could write a book about all his experiences.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Wants to know if we're going to write a book about this.
What's it?
Wants to know if we'll write a book. Well, I don't know. Certainly this interview will be available on YouTube and, so this interview will be, we don't know what we'll do about this, but certainly this interview will be available to people who are interested.
When my mother and father and sister left a shtetl
Pardon?
when my father, mother, and sister left a shtetl in Poland, they came to Palestine. They came to the United States, and my father's brother came to Afua in Palestine. And I'm curious as to what brought you to Afua
What?
during that time period.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank you for bringing your friend here. And secondly, I want to thank you for that note you sent me. Unfortunately, I noticed the ages. And the Caro family is a very famous, I don't know if you're aware of that. You're aware of that? Okay. Because in Tzfat there's a synagogue called the Caro Synagogue. But when they moved to Tel Aviv, the ages, there's a few years difference in age, and I wouldn't have any way of knowing them.
What brought you to Afua?
What brought?
What brought your family to Afua? You said you lived there.
I can't.
I think so.
What was the question?
Whether you lived in Afua.
Oh, no. The picture in the paper said the motorcycle picture was taken in Afua. Well, one of the wonderful things that happened in Israel, and that's why I think people were, I don't know if they do that today, but in my time, we used to do a lot of hiking. And we used to do a lot of traveling around the country. It's a small country. I remember, for example, when I was in the 8th grade, graduating from grammar school, we had a graduation hike. And we went by truck up to Tiberias, And then we walked all the way down to Bet Shan, which is the beginning of a small desert. We hiked that, and then we took a train for a short distance to go through the desert area, and then we walked all the way from a place called Kfar Yecheskel all the way to Haifa in a matter of 3 or 4 days. And we used to stop overnight in kibbutzim or in towns. Afula was one of the towns where we stayed overnight. And the next night we were in a place called Nahalal, and so on. So, but in 1934, an aunt of mine, who was a nurse, worked at a hospital right outside of Afula. Yeah. But that's the way you learn to love a country, is to see it firsthand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, while we would all love to see a two-state solution in Israel, in view of the population of Arabs, in view of the fact that they feel that Israel has taken their land, in view of the fact that many of them would like to see Israel disappear altogether, how do you feel, Aaron? How optimistic do you feel about the future of Israel?
Repeat the question, please.
That given Arab hostility to Israel, how optimistic is Aaron about the possibility of a two-state solution? Is that more or less what you said?
When it comes to Israel, I'm always optimistic. I had a friend who was a rabbi who once said, as long as there are people on earth, there are going to be Jews. And as long as there's going to be Jews, they're going to have a state of their own. And that's what I believe. How it's going to come about? You know, the ancient rabbi said that after the temple was destroyed, the power of prophecy was given to children and fools. So I don't want to prophesy.
Maybe one more question.
In the publicity for this event, it showed you on a motorcycle. And I'd like to know more about the motorcycle. I'd like to know, was it your own motorcycle, or was it...
Good question. Good question. First of all, I never rode a motorcycle in my life. And there's a two-part answer to that question. That motorcycle, if you look closely at the picture, you notice it was cropped. There was a girl sitting behind me. And you know what's remarkable? You know, I haven't seen this girl since 1935. She was in a high school. And I couldn't think of her name. But in preparing for this and talking with Peter about this, I took a look at the picture. I said, I know that person. Her name was Gyula Rabinowitz. In my high school class, there were 4 Americans. 2 boys and 2 girls. The other boy's name was Yair Kaplan, who graduated from the Hebrew University, came to the United States, and became a lawyer. And he was a judge in the Department of Commerce or something, a sitting judge who used to pass on land rights and gas rights and things like that. And the other girl was a girl by the name of Jean Kovetsky. The girls both came from New York. I haven't seen them since we left Palestine.
So that picture was the end of your motorcycle career?
That began and ended But as a kid, I always wanted to ride a motorcycle.
Well, maybe you'll still do that in. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming again, and thanks, Joel.
Wait a minute. I have to thank a lot of people here. First of all, I have to thank Joel. Joel, who set this whole thing up. Then I have to thank some unknown at the DNC who did the publicity. And I imagine the office people had a lot to do here too, because Joel was gone for a whole week before that. And finally, I want to thank Peter, whose idea this was to begin with, and I thank you. And of course, I want to thank all of you for coming. How long did we go?